Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU. And tonight we're delighted to be able to welcome back to Scotland Gavin Esler, who is an award-winning television and radio broadcaster, author and journalist. And we'll be focusing on his book, his most recent book of a number of them, which is How Britain Ends English Nationalism and the Rebirth of the Four Nations. And I think we have three of the four nations represented here. But anyway, so welcome everybody. But first thing, we'd like to send our sympathy and condolences to the family of Sir David Amess. Tragic and terrible event that's affected the entire country. So Gavin, what would you like to start with? You describe Brexit in your book as an admission of English insecurity and the wrong answer to the right question. And the widespread destructive effects of Brexit are piling up, as you know, in every sector, in every area of the country. It's a Brexit that anyone can say is what they voted for. And indeed, it was rejected roundly by both Scotland and Northern Ireland. Just what does this make of the country? How dysfunctional do you think this country is now? And what do you make, for example, of this aim to be global Britain?
Well, I think, hello to everybody. I'm glad to be here. I wish I was in Glasgow right now, but I'm not. But I will be shortly, I think, in a month or so. So I think Brexit is a symptom of our malaise as well as a cause. It's a symptom in the sense, let me just take a minute or two just to answer this, because it's quite complicated. Going back to 2015, not 2014 when Scotland voted against independence, but 2015 in that general election, the four different parts of the United Kingdom voted for four different parties as their main party. In Scotland, it was the SNP. In Northern Ireland, it was Democratic Unionists. In Wales, it was Labour. And in England, which is 84% of the United Kingdom, it was Conservative Party who formed the government. And in that election, 3.8 million of our fellow citizens, most of them in England, voted for UKIP, and they got nothing. Well, next to nothing. They got Douglas Carswell, a strong Brexiter who was in UKIP for about 5 minutes, and then when he got elected, he quit. So almost 4 million people, most of them in England, voted for nothing in the end. They didn't get anything. And it struck me at the time that these four different parts of our United Kingdom were drifting apart. And I started reading quite a bit about it and tried to figure out what keeps us together now. I mean, the historian Linda Colley says that historically, the United Kingdom was based on Protestantism, empire, and war. And those three things have faded in the background for most people. I hope war certainly has. And so that's really what I began thinking about. And the impulse for Brexit, therefore, came, I think, in large part from a sense in England that that they were being run by those who voted for Brexit, that the United Kingdom was being run by forces out of their control, outside our country, and there was a kind of what I call nostalgic pessimism. In other words, everything was better in the past. Let's remember the Blitz spirit. We were better before. And I'm not sure any of that is true. And so that's why I say it was the wrong answer to some right questions, because of those four nations that make up our United Kingdom, England, it seems to me in particular, we can say each part has been shortchanged in different ways, but England in particular has been shortchanged. I was talking to somebody, a strong PR activist, proportional representation activist, and she said to me, you do realize there are only 3 countries in Europe that don't have that still have the first past the post system. And those 3 countries are Belarus, the Vatican, and England, because Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales have a different system. And so even if you don't entirely buy into all that, there was a degree of resentment in England that something was wrong. It's become one of the most centralized countries in Europe. It doesn't have, for all its flaws, a Scottish Parliament or a Northern Ireland Parliament or a Welsh Parliament. And so it seemed to me that the UK was moving in very different directions. And just one other thing that I came across after I wrote the book, a Cambridge academic called Danny Dorling pointed out that even in Wales, which voted to leave the EU, if you take out English voters, in other words, people from England originally who'd settled in Wales, many of them, and retired there because it's a wonderful country to live in, there would have been a majority to remain. So we have a fundamental structural problem which helped produce Brexit, but Brexit has made it much worse, particularly in Northern Ireland.
Yes, and Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol is required to support and protect the Good Friday Agreement. And that's potentially the most dangerous flashpoint of all of this. I mean, whom do you trust about all of this and to keep things on even keel and to keep things positive and productive? Boris Johnson and Lord Frost or the EU?
Well, the EU has got its flaws like any great institution, but it was built to prevent a war again in Europe. And it helped, and I might get to that later, but it helped bring about peace in Northern Ireland too. Do I trust Boris Johnson? Well, he was somebody who didn't discuss the Irish border during the Brexit campaign in 2016. When asked about it subsequently, he said the Irish border is no more of a problem than the border between Camden and Westminster. Well, I've been to Free Dairy Corner, as it's called. I've never been to Free Camden Corner. I mean, this is just nonsense. He said that, he was in a party where a previous Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, said Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley. And after a couple of hours meeting the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, at the Wirral, Mr. Johnson threw 100 years of Ulster unionism into the Irish Sea. Now, whether you're a unionist or a nationalist, he certainly did it. And then he now says that this Northern Ireland Protocol, which he agreed and which Lord Frost said was excellent, is now within a few months absolute rubbish and has to be renegotiated. The thing that you began our conversation quite rightly by reminding us about the awful murder that took place in Southend. And Sir David Amess is not the only person who has been MP who has been murdered. We know about Joe Cox, but I'm old enough to have spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. And when I was a very young reporter, I chaired a discussion between Éire Niamh, an MP who was very close to Mrs. Thatcher, a Conservative, and Gerry Fitt, a Irish nationalist MP. This took place in London. The following day, as I was getting on the plane to go back to Belfast, where I lived for a while, Éire Niamh was murdered. He was blown up in the House of Commons. A bit later, Ian Gow, another MP close to Mrs. Thatcher, was murdered. The Reverend Robert Bradford, a Unionist MP, was murdered in Northern Ireland. Sir Anthony Berry and 4 other people were killed in the Brighton bombing, and Mrs. Thatcher was almost killed. Now, why is it that those killings are not happening now with an Irish basis? Because of the Good Friday Agreement and because of the EU, the fact that the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, and the Irish Republic were both in the EU, the Irish border didn't really matter. It mattered to those for whom it was important to see it on a piece of paper, but it didn't matter in practical terms for anybody. We have put at risk, or our government has put at risk and continues to put at risk, all of that. And so while we should all think very deeply about Sir David Amess, we should also think about what happened to other members of Parliament who were murdered in awful circumstances, and yet we have now somehow forgotten why those killings are not taking place. And I think we should remember them, and I think Boris Johnson should remember them, but I don't think he will.
You don't think he will? Yeah. One of the things I've certainly found in talking to people who are involved in supporting European Union, this kind of thing, is that almost widespread lack of knowledge, not ignorance as such, but a lack of knowledge and real understanding of the situation in Northern Ireland, and you don't know how to counter that. And other than, as I've been doing, is suggesting that people try and read the newspapers from Northern Ireland and from Ireland to try and get some understanding, because it's not covered in any degree of depth and empathy and sympathy and information and breadth of information in our local media.
Yes, I think that's true. And right at the start of our conversation, you mentioned Global Britain, or yet another slogan. And one of the extraordinary things about this, I mean, I read a lot of foreign newspapers. I've got relatives in Germany, and I've got lots of friends in the United States and in France. The idea that we are Global Britain in some way, having irritated Ireland, most of the European Union, the Biden administration, and in different ways, Russia, China, I could list them all actually, all those developing countries that we're no longer paying the kind of foreign aid that we were committed to paying because we've broken yet another promise. Is that Global Britain? Is it Global Britain to cut, as Mr. Johnson is doing, the British Army back to about 74,000 people, which is the lowest number of troops in the British Army since the War of the Spanish Succession, which was in 1715. So Global Britain is a nonsense. And when you, as a politician, seem to regard a binding agreement with the European Union as something that you can immediately renegotiate because you didn't really mean it, or you were always planning to renegotiate it, and so on, our credibility, by which I mean the United Kingdom's credibility, is shot right throughout the world. I mean, why would people trust us? And the second part of that is that, and don't take it from me, take it from Lord Ricketts. Peter Ricketts used to be the United Kingdom's first national security advisor. He's worked with lots of prime ministers. He's recently retired. He's written a great book called Hard Choices. And in it, he says that the so-called special relationship with the United States is very difficult now because one of the principal reasons why the United Kingdom was useful to the United States, it was as a strong voice in the European Union. So we have diminished ourselves in Europe, and also we will prove less useful to the United States in various matters because we've diminished ourselves in the European Union. The two are intimately connected. And as we saw when Joe Biden decided to pull out American troops from Afghanistan, Britain's voice, such as it was either ignored or not even heard at all. So we are much, much diminished, unfortunately. And I think that is a big problem. And it's going to be a very big problem as we continue to have our successful trade deals throughout the world, with Liechtenstein and Australia and other huge economies. I mean, it is clearly a problem. And why would, to go back to your other question, Rosemary, why would anybody around the world trust the word of a British Prime Minister who is apparently quite content to break his word on something of such importance?
Exactly. And it always seems to be one bit of more bad news and another bit of troubling news, one after the other. And you mentioned trust. And when it comes to the four nations, the United Kingdom, I'm not sure that we trust one another either. And, trust is another extremely important element of how we should deal with one another. And one of the things I found fascinating about your book, and I think it's probably because of your own background, your personal background and your work background and your education and your experience, the amazing experiences you've been able to have, is that your analysis of both the UK federalism by stealth and Scottish independence plans, for example. That's fascinating. And your thoughts on how the UK can start to rebuild itself together, separately. Rebuild trust, rebuild cooperation, and how might we reshape the country?
Well, I think, the book is intended both as a challenge to unionists and also to nationalists of various sorts. To unionists, the challenge is, in 1939, a Labour politician, Arthur Greenwood, September 1939, deputy leader of the Labour Party. Arthur is not much remembered now, but he was always a very interesting figure. He appeared in the House of Commons as the Nazi troops were pouring into Poland. And from the Conservative benches on the other side, Leo Amery, a very right-wing Tory, shouted out, "Speak for England, Arthur." And Arthur did. And he said, with great regret, we are unfortunately going to have to go to war against Nazism. because they leave us with no opportunity. Now, he spoke for England, but he also, in that case, spoke for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and as it was then called, the British Empire. And I've often wondered, who is it in England now who could be said to be doing that? And when I've asked people, well, you'd know, and when I've asked people in Scotland about Boris Johnson as a one nation conservative, I met the response, well, if he is, the one nation is England, not even Britain, and certainly not Scotland. And that's not, that is not something confined to people who are Scottish nationalists. The sense that he's disconnected. In Northern Ireland, there's something similar. In Wales, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, a Labour Party politician who believes in the union, says the union as it is currently constructed is over. He actually said that. So that causes great difficulties, it seems to me, in terms of the coherence of the United Kingdom in the future. Who does, within English politics, credibly speak for the United Kingdom as a whole? And I don't think these tensions are going to go away. They're not going to go away, I would say, with great respect, just because Michael Gove is giving up a career and Strictly Come Dancing and going to save the union. I mean, I think it's going to be a lot more complicated than that. And just one further point, that the challenge to nationalists in the book is how independent can a future Scotland be? How independent is any country when we are codependent or interdependent? And so I think the rather waste of time argument about Scottish independence is the one that's made that, oh, Scotland's too small and too poor and couldn't do it. I don't think that's, I mean, Ireland is richer than, is 5 million people and is a perfectly rich, rather prosperous country, richer than the United Kingdom. But there will be difficulties. And the question is, what kind of, if Scottish people vote for independence, what kind of independence would that be? I think the European Union in this plays and the changing views about what would happen to Scotland after independence may change things for some people. Certainly, I thought in 2014 that the argument that it would be very difficult for an independent Scotland, having broken away at that time from part of the European Union, the United Kingdom, I did think that there would be barriers to then rejoining separately to the European Union, because that's what European diplomats and others told me. When I put the same question now, there's a very different response, which is it would be a lot easier. Now, I'm absolutely not saying independence would be easy, but I do think on that specific issue, it would be easier for those who are in favor of it to make the case, because I think, judging on conversations I've had, becoming a member of the European Union would be a lot easier. And that's another reason why a lot of my book is directed towards England, because if that analysis is right, the future could be that England would be somewhere between Ireland, the possibility of an independent Scotland, and the rest of the EU, which is exactly being surrounded by some kind of alliance of other people that gave Henry VIII nightmares. In fact, gave British monarchs nightmares for generations. So again, I'm not prophesying it. I'm just saying those are the kind of things which are not discussed in Westminster, and they're not discussed in England because there are other problems.
So if the union were to stay together, what might the shape be?
Well, I think if the union were to stay together, and again, Northern Ireland could go a different way, but again, that would be also fraught with difficulties. It seems to me that we're already federalized in many ways, and the people who've lost out in that sense, I mean, there's different resentments in different parts of the United Kingdom. And Mark Drakeford, as I say, the Labour leader in Cardiff, says that the union is basically over and has to be rethought. And for me, if the union is worth saving, if people really believe that, then people have to start redefining what Britishness might mean in the future. Because when in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became King of England, he said, we're going to in the different identities of Scotland. I've got the quote somewhere in front of me, actually, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. He said in 1604, "We have thought good to discontinue the divided names of England and Scotland and resolved to take the name and style of King of Great Britain." And every 100 years since then, we've reinvented ourselves in different ways. The union of parliaments, which is still a matter of great historical contention. The more I read about it, the more fascinated I am about what was happening in Scotland in 1707 and so on. But we reinvented the Union then, and in 1801 when Ireland joined, and in 1921 when Ireland left. So every century it's been reinvented. If it's going to stay together, it has to be reinvented. And I come up with some ideas, which I'm not, I'm perfectly happy to discuss. I'm not sure, not stuck with any of them. But it seems to me that there has to be some kind of basic law, as there is in Germany, a constitution, which says who does what, who's responsible for what, and why. And that can be actually very simple. In Germany, in Switzerland, which is divided along linguistic lines almost in the same proportions as England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are in terms of percentages of population, a constitutional democracy works. Now, again, that kind of federal system meets all kinds of resistance, including the fact that some people find constitutional reform boring. Well, it is in its nuts and bolts, but if you don't think about how government should operate, other things will happen. And they happened in 1921 when Ireland left under the most difficult, horrible circumstances. Again, I'm not prophesying that, but I am saying that history continues. And if you dicker around as the two generations before 1921 did, then sometimes you find that something violent or nasty or very unpleasant happens and you're not prepared for it. And I think England in particular is unprepared for this.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Can we just pause here now, Gala? There's a question. So Jenny, the question.
Hi, yeah, we have a question in from Paul. So is there an argument for the UK being purely an internal market, but without the political union, just as a soft Brexit was proposed regarding the EU?
Well, I think that would work in some ways. I mean, what I suggest in the book is that we've already federalized a lot of stuff, and we certainly don't want. I don't think it's in anybody's interest to have trade barriers. I mean, just imagine an independent Scotland and England saying nothing will change. Well, there would be a border on this island. And the border in Northern Ireland is not working very well. And it would be a trade border. And are we going to have a sausage war between Carlisle Island and Fries, So what I suggest is that, and it may be that it will be shot down by both sides, but if it would be perfectly possible to have that kind of arrangement with some kind of defense arrangement, and potentially also some other matters held in common between the different parts of the United Kingdom. But I have to say, if you look back at what was on offer in 2014 by Alex Salmond and at that time, that was quite an interdependent kind of independence. I mean, it meant the Queen or the monarch would remain head of state in Scotland, acceptance of the pound, and also therefore acceptance of the Bank of England. So that's not that far away from a confederal or federal system or the kind of arrangement that you're talking about, and that was rejected. So I think the possibilities there are between those two different views. What does independence really mean, and what does what would the future hold? It is possible to have frank discussions about this and do so positively. What we're lacking is precisely that, though, frank discussions and a bit of positivity, particularly from Westminster, which seems to think, in the words of George Osborne, essentially, if you don't want the Scots to declare independence, don't let them vote on it, which again doesn't seem to me to be a very positive message for the union. I think there may be other things that could be said by other people.
And thank you. That's guaranteed, that message to make people even more, determined.
Drawn and scunnered, as I put it in the book.
Drawn and scunnered. Those are wonderful words. I'm so glad you've got them into the wider English vocabulary.
Right.
Drawn and scunnered, we all are. So, I mean, if we're going to have a sort of proper constructive argument, how do we escape what you call the governance of the bad chaps? Which I love the idea of the bad chaps imposed in the UK. first past the post. How do we counter this extraordinary, effective optimism of Johnson, and as you mentioned, the nostalgic pessimism and all this kind of othering and all the nonsense that seems to have accrued that prevents dialogue?
Well, the bad chaps, and they were all chaps, all women, obviously. This was a theory slightly tongue-in-cheek put forward by an extremely bright and hugely intelligent English political commentator. And what he said was, well, the United Kingdom doesn't have a written constitution, but what it means is that basically we seem to think that they're all good chaps, and a good chap will know when he has gone too far and will resign and just get out of politics. Well, as the person who came up with that idea and the rest of us know, we may have run out of good chaps quite quickly. And so the question is, what do you do? And that's why I suggest, I mean, for instance, one thing that really struck me was when Donald Trump was sick with coronavirus, everybody knew what was going to happen, which is the vice president takes over. And if Trump recovered, as he did, then he comes back to the job. And if he were to die, then the vice president would be there. What did we have? We had Boris Johnson got sick with coronavirus, and then we suddenly found out it was Dominic Raab, who at the time was not deputy prime minister, but would deputise. And now he is deputy prime minister. He's apparently not deputising for the prime minister. So, you know, this is the glories of the unwritten constitution, or the uncodified constitution. So we are told that we're ruled by the crown and parliament effectively, and all sorts of other kind of mumbo jumbo, whereas at least Americans, not a perfect society by any means, but they have a document that they can look at, and Germans have a document they can look at. And, you know, according to, again, the historian Linda Colley, 70 countries around the world, including post-World War II Germany, a lot of former British colonies, have constitutions written for them in part by British legal scholars. Now, the only country that doesn't have, that I can think of, obviously, is the United Kingdom itself. We've kind of got an uncodified constitution, which is a bit of a mishmash. And that just means it leads to, for example, a conflict apparently between the court in Scotland and a court in England over whether Boris Johnson was right to prorogue Parliament. And eventually the UK Supreme Court decided effectively that he was wrong to do that, which was pretty much what the Scottish version said. But this is not a sensible grown-up way to solve disputes in the 21st century. And, you know, at this point, I should declare an interest. I've got a lot of relatives in Germany, or my wife has a lot of relatives in Germany. And one of them is her uncle Bruno, who's a doctor near Hamburg. He may not forgive me for this, but just after the 2016 Brexit vote, we were sitting in his garden drinking beer. And he said to me in his very deadpan way, "Gavin, can you explain Brexit to me?" And of course, my heart sank. And I thought, how do I explain to an intelligent German relative? So I tried my best. And he clearly wasn't buying it. And I said to him, "Bruno, you're a doctor. You give me your diagnosis." And he said, "Well, it's very simple. The English had a headache. So they shot themselves in the foot. They still have the headache. And now they can't walk." Now, you may or may not agree with that analysis, but I thought that was pretty good.
Oh dear. I think that is excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Bruno may not be happy, but I mean, we're all enjoying it.
We love Bruno.
Good, yeah. How do we help England mend itself, patch itself up, and how do we all then move forward?
Well, it's very difficult, I think, because we have a part of the glories of the British system is that with the first past the post system in UK-wide elections, but obviously not for the Scottish, Northern Ireland or Welsh parliaments, we have a government with 43.6% of the vote and a huge majority of 80 seats. So it's very difficult to see what we can do about that, what anyone can do about that. What I do think is, however, that in the end, facts matter. And the facts are that things are not going well. And if I was going to say, I was hoping that coronavirus would recede. But as we're talking, it seems that cases throughout the United Kingdom are really bad again. And even coronavirus, which like an outside threat, like a war or some kind of conflict should pull us together, has pulled us in different ways too. So what I think is likely is, I have no idea what kind of mess the Prime Minister is prepared to endure over Northern Ireland, and I'm very concerned about that. Nor am I at all optimistic that there wouldn't be some kind of trade war with the European Union. And if there is, if we as a nation, a United Kingdom of almost 70 million people, were to engage in a trade war with a bloc of 450 million people, I think we would not come off very well, particularly since the Biden administration in the United States clearly doesn't seem to have great faith in our Prime Minister. So I think things are very difficult, and I'm not quite clear where this brinkmanship will end, partly because I think Boris Johnson himself isn't. I mean, this is a guy who had two versions of Brexit: do it or don't do it. He's two versions of all kinds of things. Go to work, don't go to work, have a lockdown, don't have a lockdown, celebrate Christmas, don't go out. You know, he has two thoughts on almost every subject. And eventually will have to come down on one side or another. So he has, unlike other politicians, he doesn't have an ideology, he has a style. And the style is very disruptive, rather as it was with Donald Trump, and it involves not telling the truth quite often. And that makes it very difficult to predict what he will do, because, as Dominic Cummings said, he veers about like a shopping trolley. Therefore, it is very, very difficult to see what is in store for us when we've got a Prime Minister who doesn't seem to agree with what the Prime Minister negotiated a year ago.
That's all very
sorry about that.
Thank you. Yeah. I gather we've got another question. Jenny, please.
Yeah, and there's actually I've got two questions, if that's all right. So the first one is, I suppose you heard Dominic Raab's comments about correcting judgments of the Supreme Court in relation to human rights. So do you think that he knows that the European Court of Human Rights is completely unrelated to the EU? And what are your thoughts in general about that comment? And then, so the second question is, do you think there's any place for citizens' assemblies to talk through these tricky issues?
Well, taking them in reverse order, I definitely do think there's a place for citizens' assemblies. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I've talked to lots of audiences, you know, about these issues, about Brexit as well, from Pitlochry to Dublin to Gibraltar to all over, you know, England and Northern Ireland and Scotland. And what strikes me is that audiences actually pretty sensible. You know, they come from different points of view, but they kind of want to agree, and they listen to each other, and they're quite polite usually. Not on question time, but on other formats they are. So citizens' assemblies seem to me to be a very useful way of going forward. Although the trouble is they have no particular power to move Parliament, because Parliament declares itself sovereign. On what does Dominic Raab know and what doesn't he know? I mean, I mean, he didn't know that Calais and Dover are intimately connected and they're 26 miles apart. There's quite a lot of things he didn't know. He seemed to know how to use a paddleboard. But the question of correcting judges, I've talked to quite a few people about this way before he made those comments. And this is something that's, including some judges, by the way, who can't speak publicly. And they're very, very concerned about this. This is exactly why I suggest that we need some kind of basic law or written constitution to at least codify some of these powers in ways that normal human beings can understand. Correcting the Supreme Court, now, what does that mean? What on earth does that mean? It doesn't sound, let's put it this way, it doesn't sound good. And whether he knows what the European Court of Human Rights is or does, I suspect I'm sure he has people around him, you know. I'm trying to be very polite here. You may wonder how people get to the top in politics. with this kind of background. I've often asked audiences, how do you get to be Chris Grayling? I mean, how did you get, did anybody get to be him who managed to botch his way upwards? I'm sure he's a very nice chap, but he wasn't very successful running the justice system. The probation system was partly wrecked, and then he signed contracts or got contracts with companies for ferries that didn't exist. And in Kent, he tried to organise on Manson Airport to prepare for Brexit, a kind of traffic jam of lorries. And I talked to one of the lorry drivers who went along and said, I'll delete the expletives. The man couldn't organise a traffic jam, blank traffic. Yeah. So we don't have always the best and brightest in the top positions in our government, is the way I put it.
Indeed. Now, given this unholy mess that we're in, and the thrawn and the scunnered of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and all throughout England as well, what do we keep doing?
Well, as I say, it's very difficult because we don't have a general election. We don't have under our system. Well, we all know how it works. Essentially, it's a two-party system, but we've got more than two parties. That's part of the problem, and they don't cooperate. They're cooperating now because for a short time because of Sir David's murder, but they don't cooperate. And the question is, how much influence do we have? And I'm particularly, not in the book, but I'm quite critical of how political parties operate, because for some politicians in some constituencies where they've got huge majorities, the most difficult job they ever had was to get selected in the first place. And the thing that does is it means that in certain constituencies, you get on by being towards the more extreme vocal wing of your own political party, which means that if that's the way in which you get into parliament, for some people, then you are not likely to try to work together in a way that a citizens' assembly would do. So there are problems within political parties, there are problems with in leadership, and there are problems with the promotion of people who have would be seen in any other field of human endeavor to have failed in the job, who then get promoted. And I know you're asking me to try to cheer everybody up, and I'm struggling because I think nothing much necessarily. I mean, there will be huge events. The question about Boris Johnson does now will be very important. The question about what happens in Northern Ireland will be very important. But I would point to the opinion polls, which show that he still has a commanding lead in the opinion polls. Although because England is 84% of the population, they obviously give a great deal of weight to England, which doesn't mean to say that in Northern Ireland, including within the unionist community, or in Scotland or in Wales, he's particularly popular. No,
indeed. And yeah, I suppose we just keep on keeping on and supporting one another and trying to get the correct information out there and getting involved in as much thought and discussion as we can. So with that, is there anything else you'd like to add, please?
No, I mean, I think the one thing I would say, and this applies to all parts of the United Kingdom, it particularly applies to Scotland, is that we have got so much going for us in other terms. I mean, these nations are successful in almost every field of human endeavor. I don't mean the Scottish football team, which is is not terribly successful, sadly. But in terms of our great universities, in terms of scientific breakthroughs, in terms of the attractiveness of the country in which we live, in terms of our culture, the fact that so many of the great bands and musicians that tour around the world are from various parts of the United Kingdom, or the fact that if you look at three of the greatest franchises in Hollywood, they're based on Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, Ian Fleming and James Bond, and of course on Harry Potter. So we are a hugely creative country. There's quite a lot of us, and none of us are going anywhere. So it's not beyond our wit to sort things out in terms of basic enlightenment values of respecting facts and trying to think of a way to solve problems. Our difficulty is that, it seems to me at least, we have a government which would rather create problems to keep itself in power. And that's where we have the dissonance that we're talking about tonight.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you. And yes, we've learned a lot, and a lot to keep us thinking and pondering and work, as you say, keeping all together and fighting against the dissonance that is all around us, or at least being created around us, whereas the rest of us are all together, if you know what I mean. Sorry, I'm just talking backwards here. Anyway, so thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thanks to everybody who's joined us.
Thank you.